I take the position that when you're commander-in-chief, that you really ought to keep all options on the table to be able to have the flexibility to do what is necessary in order to defeat this enemy. But to make those airstrikes work, to be able to do what you have to do, you don't just send planes in and drop bombs. You've got to have targets. You've got to know what you're going after. To do that, you do need people on the ground.
Panetta argues that President Obama is making up for lost time in going after ISIS now because of the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq in 2011. Would ISIS be as much of a threat today had we left some force behind?
I do think that if we had had a presence there, it might not have created the kind of vacuum that we saw develop in Iraq.
And he criticized the president for not arming the Syrian rebels back in 2012, a move most of the president's national security team recommended. But Obama never signed off, arguing the weapons could wind up in the wrong hands.
I mean, it's understandable, but at the same time, if we're going to influence the rebel forces, if we're going to try to establish a moderate element to those forces, that it was important to provide this kind of assistance in order to have some leverage over what they were going to do.
There was honest disagreement, but then no decision.
You know, to a large extent, it wasn't that the president kind of said no, we shouldn't do it. The president kind of never really came to a decision as to whether or not it should happen.
What do you mean by that, never came to a decision?
I think it basically sat there for a while and then got to the point where everybody just kind of assumed that it was not going to happen.
Is that the right way to do things?
I think it would have been far better had he just made the decision we're not going to do it, and so that everybody kind of knew where we stood. But we all kind of waited to see whether or not he would ultimately come around. And it didn't happen. There were these decisions that basically never were confronted that I think in many ways contributed to the problems we're facing today.
The portrait Panetta sketches of Barack Obama sometimes looks more like a professor than a president.
He relies on the logic of his presentation with the hope that ultimately people will embrace that logic and then do what's right. You know what? In 50 years, my experience is logic doesn't work in Washington. You got to basically go after people and make them understand what they have to do. And that means you create a war room, you go after votes, you have to push people.
So did you have a sense that the president found that distasteful, or that it wasn't something he wanted to do or was comfortable doing? Or
I think it offended him that people would not really get serious and work on the issues. And I think as a result of that, he just felt, you know, how can I deal with people that simply don't want to do the right thing for the country? Well, the reality is, if you want to govern in this country, you have to deal with people you don't like.
And you have to keep your word, which he argues the president did not do when Syria used chemical weapons against its own people, violating the president's clearly drawn red line.
The president very clearly should have said, you have crossed that red line, and we're not going to allow that to happen. And I think initially my sense was they were going to do exactly that. But somehow they backed away from it.
Panetta tries to reconcile the president who vacillated over Syria with the decisive Obama who gave the bin Laden raid a green light.
A president that made the decision to go after bin Laden and made a very gutsy decision to do that. And I really respected that decision. I just could not have imagined him not making the same decision when it came to the credibility of the United States on drawing that red line in Syria.
To no one's surprise, the White House has not warmly welcomed this version of history.
Former administration officials, as soon as they leave, write books, which I think is inappropriate, but anyway.
Does he have a point there?
You know, I'm of the view that you don't put a hold on history. History is what it is. You know, and I would say right now, I recommend the President and Vice President Biden take the time to read the book, because I think, you know, when you read it, it's a pretty balanced presentation of what happened.
He's not just critical of the president, but he also has a few things to say about the people protecting him. The Secret Service, obviously there's been a lot of talk lately about the security and the safety of the president.
I think particularly in the second term, there is, you kind of take things for granted. People don't pay attention to the details that they need to pay attention to. And that really requires tough supervision to make sure, particularly with the Secret Service, and particularly where it involves the life of the president and the first family, you do not mess around with that. You make damn sure that they know what they're doing.
Do you think that's what's happened?
I think they got a little bit casual about protecting the President of the United States, and I don't think you can afford to let that happen.
Wow. Gloria, there's some very stinging criticism, especially considering it's coming from the President's top guy at the CIA and top guy at the Pentagon. The White House, as you note, has pushed back quite a bit. What's Panetta's response?
Well, you know, I asked Panetta directly whether he was being disloyal. Because that's effectively what Joe Biden is saying. Why couldn't he just wait till the guy was out of office? And he pushed back on that very hard and said, you know, I believe that history is history, and that in the day and age in which we live, you don't put a hold on it, and that he doesn't consider it disloyal to tell the truth about what occurred during the White House. Now, as you know, lots of people have done that, particularly in this administration. Former Secretary of Defense Gates has done that. Hillary Clinton's also written a memoir. So Panetta is among a list of those who have chosen to do it while a president sits in office.
And those criticisms from Gates, Panetta, Clinton all seem to kind of line up. They're all very, very similar.
Well, they are, and they also, as you know, play into Republican hands over the question of ISIS and what we could have done to prevent the growth of ISIS. And you'll be hearing from Republicans about it using Panetta, I'm sure.
Sure. Gloria Borger, great interview. Thank you so much.